Well, welcome back. We're going to continue on. We're going to take our panelists who we just heard from and add some more folks and have a little more discussion. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Wilf Sommerkorn. I am currently working on a part-time basis with the Utah Land Use Institute as the Deputy Executive Director. I had a long career in public land use planning. I 39 years, worked at Davis County, Salt Lake City, and Salt Lake County. And then when my school teacher wife retired and said, I'm going to go traveling, are you coming with me? And I said, yeah, I guess I will. And so I retired as well, but I can't seem to stay away from this stuff. And so I keep getting involved in doing stuff. Okay, we heard some great and interesting stuff. As we were talking with the board members of the Land Use Institute as to what we ought to be talking about, what are the topics for this conference this year, one of the things that we talked about was the fact that we've been talking now for several years about the housing crisis and housing affordability and all of the issues surrounding that and what we can do and so on and so forth. But what seems to sometimes get overlooked is there's a lot of other stuff happening in the land use and real estate markets out there with regard to retail, commercial, and office space and industrial space. And a lot of that is very intertwined with what happens in the housing market. One frequent comment that I've heard, and I think others have heard, and many of you have heard, are, damn it, quit doing so much economic development in this state. Quit being so good at it because it just brings more people into the state and that's exacerbating the housing crisis. Have you heard that, Lou?
Yeah, we want more roads, too.
Yeah, that's right. And so are they connected? Yeah, they're connected. And in fact, some of the discussion now is that if we're going to continue to do economic development, part of that economic development package or incentive has to be housing. You're going to bring new workers to the state, they have to have some place to live that they can afford. And so it's all interconnected, just how all of this works. So in addition to the panelists or the folks we just heard from, we've added 3 new people. Cameron Diehl, who's the Executive Director of the League of Cities and Towns, and deals a lot with the land use issues regarding all of this stuff. Chris Gamvroulas, President of Ivory Development, and one of the guys who's trying to build more housing in this state. Laura Hanson, State Planning Coordinator, who really tries to look at the issues that are affecting the state of Utah, the growth and all of the things that go with it, and just recently was completed the, what's it called, Laura? Guiding Our Growth. Many of you probably filled out the surveys for that, and the results of those surveys were just made available. And they're now going on to the next phase, which is educating the public and working with them and trying to translate some of these things into policy. So what I'd like to do is I want to go with our 3 folks who have just joined our panel and have them talk about what they just heard. Our other panelists present here this morning and give you their thoughts and their impressions on that. Then have our other 4 who were here earlier today kind of react to what they have said and other things that they may have said. And I've got some questions that we'll throw out, and then we'll open it up to you folks all and get your comments and input. We've got, you look at the folks that are out here in our audience, and we've got some great people out here who know a lot about this stuff as well, and it'd be good to get their thoughts and feedback and input on this as well. So let's start. I'm going to start with Cameron and have him talk first, then we'll go to Laura, and then we'll go to Chris. So, Cam?
Perfect. Thank you, Wilf. Thank you to the Institute for hosting this tremendous discussion. And before I start into the land use questions, I wanted to give you my permission to study water anytime you want, because I think the only thing more controversial than housing is water. Is that fair? Yes. But whether it's housing, water, commercial development, industrial development, transportation, you name it, at the end of the day, it's all about quality of life. And I think everyone in here, whether you're in the private sector or the public sector, we're all in the quality of life business. And that is why Utah is such a magnet for either people like me who grew up here, went away for school but came back, or for people who live elsewhere and are looking for the quality of life benefits that Utah provides. It is very rare to be here in an office building, and very rare in the United States, to be here in this office building and have a light rail station nearby, have a professional sports venue nearby, and in 20 minutes we could all be up the canyon. Not on a Saturday. That's part of the growth challenges. But on a Wednesday mid-morning, yes, we could be up that canyon in 20 minutes. Right. Right. That's the G word you didn't want to talk about, right, Lou? Yeah.
Unless you got a big pocket.
So with that being said, whether you're on the private sector side or the public development side, we're all in the quality of life business. And it's clear in recent years that the perspective that Utahns have about quality of life has diminished. And some of that I think is justified, some of it I think is unjustified, but nevertheless, that's the feeling. So recognizing that COVID threw this wrench into everything everywhere, what does quality of life look like in Utah in 2030? What does it look like in 2040? What does it look like in 2050? That's what we're all trying to figure out. Last week, I had the opportunity to host a bunch of state league directors, my counterparts from around the country, and we did a full deep dive on frankly, the quality of life challenges that each of our states is facing, but really a deep dive on housing and land use policy. I was able to present what we've done in Utah. They presented what they were doing in different states from Arizona to Vermont, and we were sharing best practices and good ideas that were working, but also ideas that really hadn't resulted in improved quality of life. And what was fascinating about it is very similar to what we were just describing here, is that when a place is desirable, once the growth gets to a certain point, you start to lose some of those desirabilities, and then you've got to proactively plan for them. They don't just happen. You've got to proactively plan for them. So you asked Wilf about my reaction to what we heard this morning, and there were multiple key points that I could focus on. I'm going to start by just talking about the concept of centers and the concept of walkability and maximizing the limited resources that we have for job growth, the limited resources we have for new housing, connectivity, education, and the like. I was really proud last week to present to these other state league directors about a piece of legislation we passed 2 years ago here. It was House Bill 462, but it created what are known as station area plans. How many of you are familiar with the station area plan concept? Okay, so less than half of you are. In a nutshell, what state law requires of local governments is to create station area plans within a half a mile of transit stops. That would include front runner, tracks, and bus rapid transit. So any of those three areas that have transit stops are now those local governments, those land use authorities, are proactively required to plan for a variety of outcomes. Those include housing affordability, includes economic opportunity, includes transportation connectivity, but it also includes access to open space. The local government is responsible to figure out how to meet those objectives, and then once they put that plan together, it needs to be certified by the Metropolitan Planning Organization, either Mountain Land Association of Governments in Utah County or Wasatch Front Regional Council, Salt Lake, Davis, and Weaver counties. The concept is we have this massive investment that local governments and taxpayers have invested in, which is the transit service. We're starting to see more state investment into transit. And so how do we maximize the capability for more intense land use there, but do so in a thoughtful way? Ultimately, private sector and public sector got to yes on that bill because we all agreed on those objectives, and it provides some local flexibility to figure out how to meet those objectives. And all communities that have those stationary plan requirements have to meet them by 2025, with a couple of minor exceptions. Thus far, we have a couple that have already been certified. In Farmington City, for example, they recently certified their station area plan. And again, it's a plan, but it builds off of what's already in place at Station Park. That stationary plan is hoping in the next 5 to 10 years to activate the area in a way that will bring 4,500 new residential units within a half a mile of that front runner station. So that's on top of what's already there at Station Park. 4,500 units, even with the shifts in demographics, is still likely to increase Farmington's population by 15,000. So 15,000 new residents in Farmington. In Vineyard, they recently had their stationary plan certified, and they're estimating between 6,000 and 8,000 new residential units within a half mile of that front runner stop. And those are just two examples that combined are planning for more than 10,000 housing units, which would be would be walkable and connected to transit and part of that overall transit ecosystem. Now, part of the trick is, will they be owner occupied? Will they be for rent? We're still trying to figure out those pieces because there are a lot of market forces at play there too. But I think that's an example of how we're working together in Utah in a way that was really quite rare. When I talked to those other state league directors, they were all having these conversations about what do you do around transit. And when I presented the station airplane concept to them, they were very impressed and wanted to learn how it was working. So I think that's an example of how we're working together, looking at those demographic trends, looking at what people need, looking at the housing crisis, saying, okay, how do we proactively work to confront the challenge of today, but plan for the quality of life of tomorrow?
Great. Laura?
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much. Happy to be here among a lot of great, smart people and good friends. So Wilf mentioned that I have been working on this public engagement effort that we're calling Guiding Our Growth. This was in response to a few different survey responses that said that Utahns really for the first time are starting to feel like maybe growth isn't a good thing for Utah. Maybe it may not make things better. More traffic congestion, campgrounds are crowded, a variety of different things like that. And that was reinforced by some surveys from the League of Cities and Towns and Envision Utah and others. So we thought, well, this is a great time to check in with the public and say, well, how are you feeling about growth? What do you love about your communities that you hope never changes? What worries you about all this growth? And then how can we sort of manage and mitigate that? So we asked Utahns about four different topics: housing, open space, water, and transportation. And Cameron talked a little bit about, kind of quality of life and how and Wilf mentioned that these topics are interconnected. The way that we play in our communities has impacts on our water usage, on our transportation network, on the amount of open space that's available to us. And what we found from the survey was that most Utahns, about 75%, feel like growth is a good thing. We should not try to stop growth in our communities, but how we grow matters. And so a couple of points about what we heard in the survey that I think tie back to some of the things that our earlier panelists mentioned. The housing option selected in our survey that received the most support was for allowing the most housing in the most number of places. And so that was new greenfield development. It was growth around centers where we have existing infrastructure, but also expanding housing within our existing neighborhoods. So maybe more ADUs or duplexes. As we're growing further out, the public's preference was for new master planned communities. So places that build in the amenities that contribute to this quality of life. The general sense that I got from the public was, we'll accept some density, but we need to have the amenities that make a complete community at the same time. So we need to be able to have places for shopping nearby. We need to have parks and open spaces. We need to have public facilities and libraries. One comment that Aaron made, which about the flight to quality in terms of retail, one of the strategies that the public really was supportive of was redevelopment of underperforming retail spaces as a place for new housing. I think generally we want to preserve our single family neighborhoods. Building in centers is a great way to allow those single family neighborhoods to kind of have that same character. But when we do have underperforming retail, if people are moving to the higher quality spaces, that's another opportunity for us to add more housing into our communities. And then there were some questions about water earlier, and we asked about water in the survey, and so I wanted to respond to that just a little bit. Yes, we are doing better. We are conserving more water. We're using less water than we used to. That said, as we have an increasing population, and our water supply is increasingly a little bit uncertain, right? We had a great water year last year. We don't know what this next year is going to look like. There are going to be more drought years in our future for certain. We need to continue to focus on conservation. We will gain some water into our communities as agricultural areas are converted to new housing developments, but that's not going to be enough. And so The majority of our municipal water use goes to outdoor landscaping. If you have a smaller lot, you have a smaller area that's irrigated, and therefore less irrigated area per capita. There are some other factors that go into that, like the landscaping choices and your watering practices as well. But Utahns, through the Guiding Our Growth survey, said we are very supportive of more focused and proactive water conservation. And the thing that I really liked from what the public's feedback was a really sense of shared responsibility. We want agriculture to do better. We want our cities to do better. We want water-wise landscaping in new development in greenfield areas, but we also want to retrofit our existing landscape areas as well. And fortunately, there's some great rebates out there for that. So lots of big challenges here, but I think all of these topics are really interconnected, and it's important for us to kind of take that big picture and say, what do we want our complete communities to look like? What are all the component elements of that? And how can we bring one sector up, like more housing supply, while at the same time we're increasing more amenities and better transportation convenience and water conservation?
Good morning. So I guess I'm the representing the developer that cities don't like, not Ivory in specifically, but just retail or residential, right? By and large, people don't come out and oppose new office buildings or retail centers. I've never seen anybody like oppose a new Costco. Your officials go to the ribbon cutting, right? They're really excited about that. So Aaron and Lou, your clients, they're like, this is awesome. We love you. And then home builders walk in and we're like, oh no, you're a drain on our services. Like, where did you think that Costco came from? From Costco, right? So we've been advocating for better land use and better land use outcomes for residential development since 2004, 2005. That's Jody Hoffman's here. She really led the way when we recodified LUDMA, when then Senator Greg Bell led that, and we've been looking at it ever since. And we passed about 65 bills since then, 2005. And you would think that we would be done after like a dozen, but we're not. And it's because the bias, and I don't use that term in a derogatory way, but there's a anti-residential bias in cities. And I'll give you an example. We're developing a large master plan, 600 acres, and from the time we applied for our general plan amendment rezone to do a and we did get an MDA. It took us 12 months to get an MDA, and it took us 2 more years to get our first 30 lots on the ground. 6 months after our initial application, 400,000 square foot building distribution facility went into the same jurisdiction, and the city simultaneously amended their general plan, rezoned it, and approved their site plan. And once they had their site plan going, the city also approved their building permit. So in 4 months, a 400,000 square foot distribution facility was underway. And that's the hard reality. So why are we facing a housing crisis and we're not facing an industrial crisis? Tax revenue, right? And we've got to change the mentality that residential's bad and everything else is good. And it's only some residential that's bad, right? It's whoever is a lower station in life than me. And we see it a lot, but we definitely have to start breaking down some of these barriers. And the conversations that we've had at the Commission on Housing Affordability, I think, have been really productive. We have a list of consensus items. We have a list of not consensus items, which is fine. But the fact that we have a list of like 9 consensus items that are really big is you know, it's promising. I will say that league leadership and the negotiating groups with the Property Rights Coalition, the home builders, and the realtors made some really big lifts last year. Some really, really big lifts in terms of expediting reviews, particularly for residential projects. So there's shot clocks, right? And you probably heard about those. And my team in the field, my project managers, we have 44 active model homes. Those are our storefronts. So we're probably where you are or close to it. But they've already heard people say, we're going to take all the time we need. We're going to do all 4 of those, as opposed to we should expedite this process, right? And there's some municipalities that have said, you know, they've already adapted to the 4 reviews and the 20 days. Like, there's some municipalities that already did that. But we know that you can process applications faster. We know that you know, when a Costco comes in, you can do it really fast. And so when there's a subdivision, you know, a D.R. Horton subdivision that comes in, we know that you can process that quickly. And we're just hoping that we can get to a more efficient outcome of reviewing our plan so that we can build out of this. You talked a lot about the markets in the initial presentation and interest rates and those kinds of things, and that's really felt by businesses, but it's felt by everyone in this room individually, right? Mortgage companies are closing down, home builders are pulling back, and so we're actually going to exacerbate our housing shortfall over the next couple of years, because we're as builders, we're going to pull back, or we're going to retool, or we're going to, you know, bring on product in other places where we can hit a lower price point. But the current national economic environment with mortgage rates is going to really impact what we can build, and it is going to impact the affordability crisis.
All right. Thanks to our new panelists up here. Reactions from our previous panelists. Chris Nelson's indicated he's got some thoughts, and he needs to be leaving soon anyway. I guess you're going to be heading out here shortly, but let's give you a chance.
Plane to catch at 1 to fly to Atlanta to save Atlanta from itself. Not really, folks. That's just me being the ego. So I was very intrigued with the transit station area plan requirement that Cam mentioned. One thing that most transit station area planners forget, including maybe in this room, are households with children. Now, I did mention that the number of households with children is falling, but don't forget them. I did some studies for DOT that are published, came out earlier this year, I think, showing that one of the largest markets for TOD residential development are households with children. And I made a note to myself to try to circulate that among the panel members and Cam and my friends at WFRC and Meg and so forth. You know, nobody's ever thought about that as a proactive submarket for TODs. And then I'm as big an advocate for converting strip retail into mixed-use office, residential, and retail as there's anyone. In fact, I wrote a book about it. But over the years, I've realized that people who own the strip retail product don't do housing. Even in Tucson, there's virtually no density limit on converting a retail strip into residential, but it never happens. It's because the underlying owners, investors, they understand retail. They don't understand residential. Their financial supporters understand retail. They don't understand residential. We've got to find another way to create a partnership to bring the surplus retail land into residential, because the private sector is so balkanized, it's probably not going to happen on its own. Certainly a few exceptions, but they are the exceptions that prove the rule. Lastly, on retail, so in my view, communities are comprised of people, and people are the soul of the community. But it's the retail that becomes the heart of the community, and we don't do enough to make the retail the heart of communities. And I think that's an opportunity for future planners and investors.
You know, it's interesting when Chris mentioned that about the redevelopment of these strip retail centers. I happen to be on the planning commission in my home community where I live, and we have an old strip commercial center that really, I mean, it really needs to be redeveloped, and the owners feel that way as well. And we've, with our new modern income housing plan, and with the other things that we've put in place, mixed-use zoning that we've put in place, we've really kind of been encouraging and saying, you know, look at doing maybe some residential in that area. The owners of that strip retail center, Chris, they're keen on redeveloping commercially. The suggestion that we've made to them that they include residential, they're kind of like, they're not real keen on the idea. And so, you know, that's just one anecdote, but it kind of goes to what you were saying. Other panelists, Chris?
Yeah, so we've had some experience with this. Our commercial arm, ICO for short, Ivory Commercial, is developing and building about 600 apartments in Murray right now on the old Kmart lot on 9th East across from the Home Depot. And it was an interesting entitlement process because all of the residential housing around that Kmart lot is actually in the city of Mill Creek, but the Kmart was in Murray. And so the entitlement was actually a lot easier. Now, Murray wasn't excited about losing the commercial base because that Kmart had been closed for a decade. And so we added commercial in along 9th East. We're building some pads along there. And they'll probably perform better than an empty Kmart, I'll tell you that. So I think that there is an appetite for that. And actually, Mill Creek City and Mayor Silvestrini's here has been really good because, you know, their residents need to flow through this property. So we've been coordinating with both cities really carefully. But there are opportunities to do it. And it can look really good, and it can, you know, create other opportunities for more commercial, and probably makes that, I mean, it's a busy Walmart, and I haven't seen a really slow one. But, you know, you get 600 more households there, you're going to at least create a better base for the existing commercial that's there.
Diehl.
And just to add to that, I think we zone by sales tax dollars, and that's part of the equation in this problem. If we're looking at long term, and you know, Chris kind of showed online trends, that changes our structure of our city budgets, albeit in a glacial pace. But you know, if you think 15, 20 years ahead, your source of retail sales tax dollars are going to look a lot different than they do today. So, you know, you would maybe want there to be a little bit more growth than you're comfortable with at the moment if we're just talking about sales tax.
So, Wolf, I can't let the conversation sales tax go without jumping in here. I think but
It should all be population based?
No, I think no. I actually think long term, the way we finance cities in Utah, the way we finance local government in Utah, with sales tax, property tax, gas tax, and like all of those are under pressure, right? So you look at property tax, for example. Property tax is under political pressure because it's the most hated tax, and there are already limitations that the legislature has put on the ability to use property tax. Sales taxes is under pressure because of the shifting nature of how we consume goods. Gas tax is under pressure because how many of us drive more efficient cars today than we did 10 years ago? And that's going to be more and more the trend. And if you drive an electric vehicle, you're not paying gas tax at all. So all the different revenue streams that pay for the police, that pay for roads, that pay for the services that we rely on for that quality of life, all of those have different pressure points on them. That being said, when you think about mixed use done right can actually be a solution to that long-range piece. One, you get property tax revenue from that higher intensity land use, especially if mixed use is done in the right places. And I mentioned stationary plans, that's one example. I think the example on 9th East is a great example. Since you mentioned Mill Creek Common is another terrific example. How many of you have been to Mill Creek Common? Okay, if not, Mayor Silvestrini's in the back, he's happy to take you on a tour. Mill Creek Common, there you go, yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, Mill Creek Common is awesome. And it's the exact illustration of what we're describing here. Once upon a time, the area around what is now called Mill Creek Common, was your 1980s era traditional commercial. A lot of strip malls. In fact, the temporary city hall for Mill Creek City was in one of those empty storefronts at the old strip mall. Well, over the course of a few years, Mill Creek City first engaged their residents about what they want their community to look like. And this gets to the comment, Dr. Nelson, you were referencing about the heart and soul of a community. Ultimately, what Mill Creek elected officials were doing and engaging with their public is identifying what did they want the heart and soul of their community to look like. What came out of that process was first that public amenity. And now the heart of Mill Creek Common is the public amenity, which is a roller skating rink during the summer and an ice skating rink during the winter. And there's year-round programming on that site. Then what comes from that is you've seen the city working with the private sector to repurpose dozens of properties in that area, and they're building up. So when that project is completely done, even though Mill Creek Common, the amenity is done now, but that amenity has become the magnet that has brought housing and new commercial opportunities to the heart of Mill Creek. It's a great location because there are bus lines there. You've got existing roads. There do need to be some upgrades that the city's been working on because of the higher intensity land use in that area. But over the course of the next decade, you're going to have thousands of new housing units that are all coming to that public amenity. So you've been able to, again, come to that quality of life that Laura and I were referencing, and the mixed use piece becomes a win financially for the city because you're going to see the sales tax revenues, but you'll also see more residential. So the 50% sales tax that comes from population, your population's increasing. You're seeing the sales tax piece. The sales tax is more sustainable because you've got the people on the ground like you were describing at 9th East. You've got higher property tax revenues over time because of the higher intensity land use. It really does become a win-win in how we grow and how we plan and how we're ultimately financially sustainable.
Great, thank you. Aaron or Lou, comments from either one of you about what you're hearing?
I'd be happy to.
Laura, can you hand him that mic?
This is exciting, and I think nothing sells better than an example that you can point to. If it's Mill Creek or something else that people will say, yeah, let's get behind it. I think Daybreak's been a big magnet in that way as well. You show success, people say, we can make it work, and we want to be like that. I was just, when talking about the Guiding Our Growth survey, no matter what, we're going to run into some challenges. For example, on the survey result, they said in urban Utahns, 20% want to slow or stop housing approaches to try to stop growth. But 20% want to stop, 60% somewhat or strongly disagree with this approach. So no matter what, we're going to run into these kind of problems. Part of our job is to engineer consent to say, yeah, this is what we want to do going forward. On the water, this may sound silly, but I'm not a golfer, and I thought, I look out there and I see those beautiful golf courses. It'd be nice. I think Las Vegas has got a rule that you can only have so many acres and 18 holes that have grass. And so I made that proposal to some civic leaders, and they said, you crazy? Golfers, they really vote. So we're not even going to try that. I'm thinking, okay, but that is such a positive and visible recommendation that we are really, as a community, trying to conserve water. And you can do something smart about that as well. The church across the street from where I live, they've taken out the grass. They're trying a test project and see what happens when we put zero escaping in. That shows we really are committed in the neighborhood to trying to do something. So if we have the examples of mixed use, the examples of conservation, the examples of Utahns working together, I think that's really a strong poster child for engineering consent and guiding our growth in a smart way.
The problem is those 20% that want to stop building, they're the ones that go to city council meetings. The other 60% stay home, right? And then when your elected officials get the sense that that is the sense of the community, right, then they behave in a different way. And the real challenge is that, like I said, I've never seen people come out to a city council meeting and oppose a Costco. You have? Okay.
Boy, did we get opposition to a Walmart. In Salt
Well,
Lake
yeah,
City.
I mean, but Walmart, you know. I'm just kidding. It was the one in Centerville, right?
No, Salt Lake City.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it was opposition to a Walmart becoming a Walmart, right?
Kmart becoming a Walmart.
Well, Walmart owned the land,
Yeah.
and they were making it I lived in just below Parley's when that was happening, and I was talking to my neighbors like, you guys are nuts, and they were like, well, traffic's going to increase in our neighborhood. I was like, no, they're not. But so they built. Guess what they did? They renovated an old Walmart just because of neighbor opposition, when that was the worst possible outcome that could have happened there. And a lot of times, the involvement of local officials or local residents creates a less desirable outcome, but it's done to placate locals. And I hear all the time, like, best decisions are made at the local level. And I'm like, no, they're not. I'm not saying that they're made at the best decision made at the state level or federal government, but it's not a default. Just because it's local, it's better. Is not like, you cannot default to that. That's not necessarily true.
I would agree with everything that was just said. And I will say, I went to a city council meeting. Do you remember the first Facebook deal? So the first time that Facebook looked at the state, Lou and I were both in economic development, and that was a 6-hour city council meeting. And it was based on water use, and it was not in my backyard. And I think what is really critical is, for a long, long time, we've been in the position as a state where there was so much room to grow and the ability to grow that people could just say, not in my backyard. Nope, go somewhere else. And it worked. And things would bounce around until they found a home. That's not real anymore. And I think for a lot of people on the local level, for many, many years, they have not tied together economic development and housing and houselessness and economic. They haven't connected all the dots because it hasn't been in their backyard, and now it is. And so instead of just saying, go over here or not there, and we saw it with respect to the homeless service shelters, service centers, when they were being moved. That was such a moving target because every time it landed on a place, there would be a protest and it would move somewhere else. And until we, as professionals, no matter what our field is, help educate locals and our elected officials on what this needs to look like going forward, we will continue to have protests, and we'll just continue to compound the problem. I believe, looking at Salt Lake as the model and kind of blowing it out, is that people, I think we're all placing a lot of hope on the younger generation. I know I am. I'm putting it all on my 3-year-old son, but I think people are starting to see that they have to be involved, and it can't just be a not here, somewhere else. And I don't know if you would echo that in the responses you saw. I hope that's the case. I think it's really, that's what gives me hope, so.
Well, and let me throw this out. Laura, we talk about the survey you just did, and for the urban residents, 60% say they feel pretty good about somewhat higher density, some alternative housing styles. They generally say that's a good idea, 60% or so. And then we have the 20%, and Chris says, well, it's the 20% who show up at the meetings, not the 60%. And so that partly drives that. But I've had this sense as I've read about other studies and then seen what happens in other locations and in places where I've been professionally in my career. What also kind of seems to happen is, and then I just had this kind of confirmed, I guess, by a study that was released in September. The study was done by Qualtrics and Redfin. And what they said was that people will generally say that they're in favor of higher density, alternate housing styles and so on, until it comes to one proposed in their neighborhood. And then the support drops down into the 30s, into the 30%. So it's fine if it's somewhere else in the community. It's not fine if it's in my neighborhood. How do we address that, folks? And Chris, that goes to your point that some of those 60% then show up at the meeting on the other side of what they expressed in the survey.
So I've been advocating a kind of a crazy approach, not so crazy to me, but not really well accepted local governments. But that's that we make administrative, or we make zoning administrative. You have a legislative adoption of your general plan, which means that your general plan has to be done well. It means there's got to be oversight. It means that you're going to lose some power. And then when it comes time to change the zone, it's an administrative act, and the zoning doesn't. The zoning doesn't matter. I'm going to read you a quote. This is, anyone familiar with our Avenues project? You've seen it in the paper. It's been in a few times. This quote is from a letter to the editor in August of 2020. And this is taking 3 undeveloped acres in the Avenues, 7 units to the acre on it, putting 21 units. It's next to a 6-story condo building and 49 townhomes. Those are our two most proximate neighbors. This development, were it to be built, would be passionately resented by residents of the Avenues, said Peter Wright, who heads the coalition and lives nearby in a 6-story condo building. While we recognize the city faces a severe housing shortage, individual housing projects have to make sense. This one does not. Like, I could not have scripted anything more NIMBY for a dude to write a letter to the editor, right? Like, if I had been like, I'm going to write a NIMBY letter, I'm going to write that. Now, and this is like August of 2020, and all these people had like no Ivory home signs in their yards, or 500 of them in the Avenues, and right next to like BLM signs. And then none of them understood the irony of that, right? They were all about equity and inclusion, except in the Avenues, right? And these people don't live in the Avenues. They drive past the Avenues to get to the upper Avenues. So they're not even Avenues residents. And how do you talk sense in this? And when there's 40 people in the Salt Lake City County building saying these words, right, and intimidating. Now, fortunately, by the way, Salt Lake City Council, on a 4-2 vote, wasn't unanimous, voted to rezone the property. And we're now going back to the Planning Commission. But it's just, if you can figure out how to inoculate your elected officials and have them make decisions early on when you're planning your city, then you can inoculate your elected officials. So now we don't go back to the city council. We just go back to the Planning Commission, and it's an administrative review to approve our project.
Let's go to Laura and then Chris Nelson.
So as we were crafting the survey, we really tried to figure out how can we help people understand and make the connections between the decisions that they make in their own communities and how that affects the region. And if everyone says, oh, I'll use Cameron's favorite thing. If Cameron's, I don't want it in my city, but it'd be great in Cameron's city. It's not going to work. I don't feel like we can really change people's minds with any sort of education. I think they need to come to that on their own. I think providing city officials and local decision makers with good data, I think results in good policy. And so I feel like there's an opportunity there to provide good information about kind of the facts, right? Pros and cons. If you do this, here are the outcomes of that, and just provide good policy and have people, come to those conclusions on their own. One thing that I don't think we have been talking enough about as a state is that we have an aging population, and I think some of this may also be kind of a temporal issue, and that as our communities age and we realize we don't need these giant homes and it's too much to maintain and it's too hard to maintain, maybe we don't have the ability to drive any longer. My parents are aging. We're trying to find a place for them that's single level living, that's nearby us, where they can walk to a grocery store and maybe have good access to public transportation. Not much of it exists out there right now. And you look at Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute's projections, and we're going to have a lot more older people in our community that are going to be having changing needs in the way that they live. And so I feel like maybe some of this will resolve itself in time, just as we start realizing that maybe we don't all need to be in single-family houses with these giant yards. So I don't know.
Chris?
Actually, Chris and Laura took my thunder away, so that's fine.
Okay.
I would just like one comment. Part of that problem is that those aging parents are in 3% mortgages, and they don't want, that's what's slowing down such the turnover in there that should be happening.
Good point.
May I just say just one quick comment to what Aaron said about, we are so blessed here in Utah. When we were putting the new prison, moving the prison to the new site, the site selector who was making some of these decisions came by and asked us, we are having so much problem because nobody wants this in their backyard. And he said, I've done 53 site selections around the country. Everybody is excited to have those prison guard jobs. In Alabama, those are the highest paying jobs in the community. But you aren't interested in that here. I said, that's because we got the best economy in the country. We're so blessed by that we don't look at prisons or other places as where we want to actually have these opportunities. And that's why we keep throwing it out now, where it ended up in the Great Salt Lake at an original cost of $400 million. It was $1.1 billion by the time we got done. So think gondola. Okay. Anyway.
How do you really feel?
I have to vote on this.
Let me ask another related question then. And Chris Gamvroulas has kind of been pushing, saying we need to talk about this. We've been talking a lot, and there have been a lot of changes made legislatively and at the local level with regard to housing affordability, how we treat housing, moderate housing income plans, all of the stuff that have been happening. And then just recently, the governor made a pretty fiery statement saying, in essence, to the local governments, if you don't want the state telling you how to do this, then you better figure out how to do it. That garnered a lot of reaction. And some of the reaction was pretty much like from local officials was, we're working on this. You've been telling us for several years we need to do things, we're trying to do it, and now you're blasting us again. That was some reaction. Now I think we all know that there are some communities that really aren't doing anything. And so the comments from the governor were not completely inappropriate. But there was kind of a reaction. And part of the reaction, it's interesting what I've been seeing as well, what's been happening at the local level, is that because of all of these things that have come down, when the local officials are now adopting their moderate income housing plans with a lot more in it with regard to moderate income housing and higher densities and all of that goes with it. And then when they get development proposals that would be in conformance with those plans, and the councils are doing that, and the what you would expect, the NIMBYs that would show up at the meetings, and the explanation they get back from their officials is, well, the state's making us do this. And whether they really feel that way or not, it's kind of a way to shift blame. To say, well, yeah, we really don't want to do this. The state's making us do this. And now I'm starting to hear from the citizens themselves, some of them saying, well, the state just needs to stay out of our community's business because, we know what our community needs and wants and should do. Are we facing a beginning of a citizen backlash, folks? And what is that going to mean? Yeah.
You can take this one.
Yeah, Chris just
Yeah.
leaned over to me and said, "Go ahead." So,
I'll follow up.
so Wilf, you asked, the final question was about citizen backlash, but there were probably 4 questions before you got to
Yeah.
the citizen backlash phase. So I think I got them all. I'll start with the last one. Are we facing a citizen backlash? I think we need to take a step back from that for a second. The people of Utah have a right, whether we like it or not, to voice their opinions of what their community looks like. Now, is that a backlash, or is that just the overall citizen engagement that you want in the country? To me, there's a line that you cross where it doesn't, where you cross the line of like it being productive, but people still have that right, okay? And the legislative power that state legislators utilize, that city council members utilize, that legislative power comes from the people themselves. So we do need to acknowledge that, we need to respect that. I think the Guiding Our Growth survey data, along with some of the other research that has been done, demonstrates that the quote-unquote backlash you're describing, like, that's the reality. I mean, Chris would tell you that he's seen that backlash for most of his adult life, right? And so really, to me, the bigger question is not, is there a backlash and are residents mad that the state's telling cities to do this or do that? I think the bigger conversation comes back to saying to those residents, what should we look like? What should we look like as a community 5, 10, 20 years from now? If we say no to this particular proposal, then what is the alternative? Because I think if the conversation is we're just going to stand still and there won't be any change whatsoever, that conversation in itself is a non-starter because change is happening whether we like it or not. So I think recognizing that even those angry residents have a right to be heard, and even if we fundamentally disagree with what they say, they still have a right to say it. And there will be times where elected officials or property owners will hear something, say, we hadn't thought about that. We need to improve the project, improve the proposal accordingly. Chris mentioned that there were some big bills that have passed in recent years. I talked about stationary plans. That was from 2 years ago. Well, last year, we did have this really in-depth discussion about the role of the public. Because I just talked a second ago about the legislative authority, and I'm not a constitutional law professor, so I'm going to try to keep this at a level that we all understand it, but that legislative authority really comes from the people, right? So a city council exercises that. They exercise that when they set policy for the city. The legislature sets policy for the state. The governor does not have legislative authority, right? The governor has the bully pulpit, and frankly, I welcome the governor making statements that bring urgency to important issues. And I think the nuance to the governor's press conference last week was he basically said, cities, you have told us you don't want us dictating to you. So demonstrate to us that you are being responsible with this authority, and we will partner with you on infrastructure, we'll partner with you in these ways, but show us that you feel the urgency that I feel as the governor, okay? That's what I took away from his message. Well, coming back then, the governor doesn't cast a vote until the very end of the process at the Capitol, right? Because he exercises that administrative and executive authority. So at the city level, the city council exercises that legislative authority, but they also are allowed under state law to exercise administrative authority. And this does put city councils in a precarious spot. Because when residents come in, the resident doesn't know, even if it's listed on the agenda, if that city council member is acting in a legislative capacity or administrative capacity. And when they're acting in that legislative capacity, it is absolutely vital that those elected officials are listening to the residents. But when they're acting in an administrative capacity, courts have told elected officials, you should not take those comments into account. But if you're an elected official who ran for office because you want to represent the people, it is hard to know where do I draw that line. So what we tried to do in last year's bill that Chris referenced was to say once you get to a certain point in the land use process, and last year we focused particularly on subdivisions. Once you get to the subdividing of the land, that's not a policy conversation. The policy was the general plan, which is the high-level aspirational view of what you want your community to look like. The zoning is the legislative act, and we can talk forever about whether zoning should be legislative or administrative, but on the current law, it's a legislative act. That gives you the details about how you develop, but those are setting the policy. Then when you get to the actual implementation of that policy, what the governor does at the state level and what city staff does at the city level, should elected officials be making that administrative decision on subdivisions? Because that's when the residents come in and say, wait a minute, they want to subdivide this piece of property. Well, the city, ideally those elected officials are saying it's consistent with the general plan, they meet all the requirements in zoning, we have to say yes. We have to say yes. So even though you want to respond to your constituents, you have to say yes if it's consistent with those things. So what we clarified in law last year is trying to streamline this subdivisions process is to say, once you get to that final approval place, city councils aren't the ones exercising that administrative authority anymore. And we think over time, that'll make a major difference for the speed in which developments can get finished. And we think it takes away the need to make general plans binding or other more draconian steps further upstream, because we're clearly delineating when those elected officials and by extension the people have their right to speak and be heard, and then when it shifts over to the administrative action where, do you meet the standards, yes or no? Perfect, let's proceed.
Any other comments before we're going to go to the public, or the public? You're our audience, and see what questions that you may have. I will say this. I am also, I talked about the backlash and about those things, and I was being deliberately provocative. But I will say that being a planning commissioner at this point, and as we've gone through some of these processes in the last little while, I am seeing more citizens coming out being vocal in support of these changing policies, more than I've seen in the past. It's still not as much as the other, but I am seeing more, which I find interesting. All right, let's go to you all. What questions do you have? There's a question in the back there. Craig, all the way back up there. Hang on a second. Craig's bringing you a mic.
You must have the microphone or it will not be picked up on the audio tape. Thank you.
I just have a couple comments, observations that I would really be interested to hear the panel comment on, but I have a feeling no one's going to want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. So I'm experiencing this myself. I have all adult children, and all of my adult children and all of my grandchildren but one are living in my house. Why? Because, you know, even though from the top looking down, we have this rosy, really good economy in Utah, the reality is we aren't producing jobs that produce a living wage for young adults. It's just the bottom line. And we don't have affordable housing. And so a couple of thoughts I've had floating around in my mind as I've had 10 people living in my house. I mean, my car looks like a residential treatment facility that I represent, you know, so, or my house, there's just cars everywhere. And my whole neighborhood's like that. And I live in a single family neighborhood. So I'm saying to myself, well, why do we continue to have these census caps on the number of unrelated people that can live together in a single family dwelling? Because the reality is, related people are just bunching up to deal with the housing crisis. And so maybe if cities lifted that from, say, 3 or 4, because in most cities it's 3 or 4, to 8, maybe what would that look like? That's one thing I'd like the panel to maybe comment on. The other thing is, just from an institutional standpoint, what would it look like if our churches became involved? Because I think there's this guy named Jesus who lived a few thousand years ago, and I think we kind of actually set the clock of human existence to coincide with his birth, said a few things about housing. And I just wondered what it would look like if our non-governmental institutions got behind this more. Because I mean, I feel Chris's pain is palpable, and I get it. I can feel it. And, he's talking about we need a change in consciousness, change in people's hearts. So what efforts could be made to get that part of the community involved to address this issue? So those are my two questions, the census cap involving church institutions to address this issue.
Anybody want to address
I'm going
that?
to touch that. You thought no one wanted to touch that. I grabbed the mic, and now they're telling me to say something, so say that.
There is no census cap on unrelated persons anymore.
No, there may be in local regulation. The state
In local code, yeah.
local. The state preempts. The state says it cannot be below 3.
The state preempted us 3 years ago.
Yeah, and says it can't be below 3 for university communities and below 4 in other communities.
But that was preempted in House Bill 82 3 years ago. That cap no longer exists.
Wow, I just looked it up on the LEDMA. It's
Oh,
still there.
So the question is about the caps, and there was discussion as part of House Bill 82 3 years ago to change the caps. So we're kind of having behind-the-scenes conversations here about what ultimately ended up in the bill, but that was a major part of the conversation 3 years ago.
So I think we need to address the fact that two presumptions have been made. That if the census cap hasn't been changed, that would resolve it. And two, that if church religious institutions tried to institute change, that would change it. So I think those are two large presumptions, perhaps not incorrect, but I don't think they address the whole problem. And I think what we do need to recognize, and I actually did bring this up at the end of my presentation, is that we haven't kept pace. Our wages have not kept pace with housing, and that there is an affordable housing crisis. So we all recognize what you're saying, and some of us are in your exact same position. I have several adult nieces and nephews living with me right now, so whom I love, but want them to move out. Please don't send them the tape. So I think those are two large presumptions, but I think we also need to be really honest in that the most powerful voice is going to be the money. And so who's the money? It's employers, it's businesses moving to town. Are they willing to pay a higher wage? And I see a smile that you may not agree, but they were coming to Utah because it was cheaper labor to begin with. As we have had more net in migration, and we saw Dan's chart, it's flipped. I'm telling you, I can't hire anyone qualified to do the jobs for what is considered market. I have recruited 3 people from the Washington, D.C. metro area in the last 6 months. I have to pay them more than D.C. I have to pay a couple of my researchers more than New York because they won't come unless I give them what they need to buy a house. I think we also need, and Laura's data supports this, I think we also need to start thinking about what housing looks like. And I know that for those of us that grew up here, it looked a very specific way. It was on half an acre, a quarter of an acre. People are very resistant to raising kids in urban areas. That may be the reality for folks going forward. And I just want to throw that out there. I'm not making any policy statements. I'm not saying whether I agree. But I think some of the challenges we're seeing are people wanting to have the same economic and availability opportunities that existed in 1980. And I think we all know that that's not the case anymore.
All right.
I have one quick addition to that,
please,
if
Laura,
that's
go
okay.
ahead.
So one of the questions we asked in the Guiding Our Growth survey was, we gave a list of different policy items and said, which of these would you support your local leaders exploring in more detail? And one of them was being more selective about the types of businesses we attract to Utah. And it got a lot of support. And I know EDC Utah and GOEO are both kind of thinking in the same space, that we're in a really enviable position as a state, that we don't need to take any job or prison jobs that come to our state. We have the ability to be choosy. And there is a real focus on attracting the highest, if we're going to roll out the red carpet, let's make sure that it has really high paying jobs, high quality jobs that support us here. So I just wanted to make that one addition.
All right. Dave Peterson over here, and then we'll go over here to Scott, and then over here.
Pass that down there.
Yeah, in Farmington in 2019, we adopted affordable housing ordinance, and on our committee that helped us formulate this, we had some developers on there too, not only representing multifamily but single-family developers. And we developed this system where that if they set aside a certain percentage of their houses for to meet the 80% AMI, that even the city council agreed that we would increase your density to make your performance whole, to make you whole. And it was a great system. And then all of a sudden inflation occurred, and all the prices of materials went up, and then the interest rates went up, and developers can't do it anymore under our own old system, and it's hard for them, and we understand why. But in all this, sometimes if we get asked, what happened to condos? Condos used to be a great way, condominiums, for a young couple to earn equity, get equity, or single households and so forth. How come we don't have a condo market anymore? And then the second part of this question is, are we going to get an MLB team here in Utah or not?
Yes.
With a condo.
And if so, what will be the name?
So the condo thing is interesting. I appreciate, Dave, you talking about how there was an incentive to create that, and 2019, 2021 was a absolute insane time to be in a home builder. It was just crazy what was going on, and people bidding up houses and materials going up. But let me tell you, when in 2022, when interest rates started to rise and people stopped coming into our models, or that slowed down, interest rates kept going up, but we kept getting material price increases. We've had 3 increases on aggregates on concrete since the end of 2021. We've had 3 different increases, 8-9% at a time. So materials aren't coming down. As to the condo thing, that is that's an interesting question. A lot of it has to do with financing, the building itself, construction financing, it's not about liability, construction liability in Utah anymore. It really has to do with HUD and FHA financing. But Edge Homes has been building a lot of condos, and so has Flagship. A lot of those have gone to, and I saw Paxton walk in a little bit ago. You could talk to him about what they're doing. They're building 10 and 12 plexes, but a lot of those are going to investors anyway. And so investors have been buying those. And so it's a challenge. It's a hard thing to build. One of the other problems with financing condos is that your HOA dues are so much more because you don't own the structure. The HOA owns the structure, and they've got reserve account requirements and other things. So you build a condo building, and somebody has an HOA of monthly of $400 a month because they don't own the building. They own the airspace, the paint to paint. And we did analysis about 6 months ago. For every $40 you increase someone's HOA dues, you decrease $7,000 worth of buying power, because HOA dues count towards your ability to qualify for a mortgage, and so it gets counted in as you're qualifying. And so for every $40, it's $7,000 less buying power, and so it's a really complicated issue, but Paxton can help you with what they're doing with condos.
Okay, Scott?
Thank you. So being on the city side with North Ogden City, we've been put in a really precarious position by the state of saying, plan for and do something for moderate income housing, But my ability as a planning director, as an economic development director, to control what the end cost of a home is zero. I mean, literally zero. And I've been told by more than one developer, big developers, that I can sell the same house on a 6,000 square foot lot as an 8,000 square foot lot for the same price, because I can find a buyer who's going to value 4 bedrooms and 3-car garage and no yard, and I can find somebody who's going to value that same exact size structure on an 8,000 square foot lot and want to mow it on a Saturday. So even rezoning for densities that are going to produce moderate income housing, I don't think it's working. And then you add on interest rates and materials and all these other things, and you got cities like Dave over here, who's been a planner I've looked up to for 20 years, coming out with super creative ideas, and they're not panning out. So at the city level, I mean, I've got 1,100 units in North Ogden that are entitled. I would give you a building permit tomorrow, and we've got all these people sidelined waiting to pull them out because I can't produce $3 million for somebody to build an apartment complex. So how do we as the city, and this is for any of the developers, for CAM, for anyone willing to answer, how do we actually create a policy tool that will produce on the other side in the free market affordable units? Because as a city, I don't see that it's a power that I have, but I'm being tasked to do it from the state legislature.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think that going from an 8 to a 6,000 square foot lot is going to create housing affordability, it's just not, right? You're going to have to get really serious about doing that, and then it's going to take public investment. And the MIHP, MHIP. You guys have so many acronyms in government. I mean, there's like 27 tools in there, right? There's 27 options, and so it's going to be different for, different communities. We've loved working in North Ogden. Ward Farms has been great. We're gonna, if there's a place we can, continue to build in your city, let's talk. Infrastructure is an interesting challenge, right? So I hear a lot like, well, we've got 100,000 entitled units or 10,000 or whatever we have statewide, and I've seen the charts. One is that there is a real limit on infrastructure, and it's one thing to get entitlements; it's another thing to be able to connect to a sewer line. The other side of that is, and I gave this example earlier, is I can get 3,000 lots entitled in City X. Well, it takes me 3 years to get 30 lots on the ground, right? Because there's this 19-month preliminary and final plat process. Then, yeah, we're going to have a housing affordability problem because we're not getting enough units to the ground. And if you think that that City X got a better result in their engineering by doing it in 19 months versus 7 or 4, they didn't. They didn't get a better outcome, right? And so it's more complicated than just, well, we signed a development agreement, right? You then have to help like move stuff out. And so I'm just going to be the greedy developer. Well, no, I'm not the only one. There's a couple of other greedy developers here. But we are the for-profit side of the company, right? Clark and Christine Ivory have a very generous foundation. They've been doing a lot on the nonprofit side. I mean, right now we're building 1,200 units in Ivory, the Ivory Innovations Operating Foundation. We have 1,200 units under construction today in the foundation. It's an operating foundation. But if there's going to be, if a community wants to get housing affordability, they're going to motivate it through some kind of a density bonus, or they're going to put money into it. The way that South Jordan put $900,000 into townhomes in the city of South Jordan that we built, and they're deed restricted, and they put $100,000 per door to get city employees and school district employees into home ownership in their city. The first person that closed on there was a police officer. And who doesn't, if you're a city official, who doesn't want a South Jordan cop car in a driveway in South Jordan, right? And so that's how you're going to get there. There's going to be public investment. You're either going to waive fees or you're going to give density bonuses if you want to get for sale product. For rent product is going to be easier.
So let me just interrupt for a second on the basic premise. Diehl, it seems like the chart you showed of Harriman showed that reduction in lot sizes did have a softening impact on price increases. So could you just talk for a second about the fundamental issue that was stated at the beginning, that lot sizes don't create less expensive housing?
Yeah, I mean, the data speaks for itself on that. I don't really have much more to add. It's Bluffdale. It's a perfect example. Everything that was selling was at an acre, and you drastically reduced the topography of different housing types. Even when prices are increasing, well, they're not increasing as much if we're building smaller lots. So that's really nothing else to it.
I want to jump on Scott's question here too, because I think it's a question I hear from city leaders across the state, and I think it is a critical one because the state has put these mandates on local governments. Local governments do not control the market forces, many of which Chris was just describing, right? We have no control over interest rates. We have no control over inflation. We have no control over materials. We have no control over the labor shortage. We have no control over a lot of those market forces that are the inputs into those housing costs. What local governments do control and do influence is the planning and zoning side and how we plan. And so we often say cities don't build housing, but we plan for housing. And I think some of Diehl's data earlier demonstrate that we are doing a good job in Utah in changing how we plan to keep up with these changes. So you shared data earlier about the trend line of single-family apartments and townhomes, and we had a 3-year stretch pre-interest rate spike where you saw a record number of new townhomes permitted, new condos permitted, new apartments permitted than any time in recorded history in Utah, right? And the share of single family has gone down. So on one hand, you look at that data and you say, okay, this is a good sign of the changing nature of housing types, that cities are permitting for that. Now that's the permit side. Then you have the entitled side. So Scott, you referenced 1,100 in North Ogden. Our internal data shows over 165,000 entitled units in cities. That's about 60 cities around the state. So 165,000 units. Now, this is where I'm going to agree with Chris. 165,000 units doesn't mean that 165,000 units can be built tomorrow, right? But at least that first step, the NIMBY step that we were talking about, we've passed that NIMBY step for 165,000 potential units because the zoning is already in place. The legislative action has already happened. So to me, the core question is one that Chris answered your question with, Scott, which is, how do you get those units to the finish line? And it's a different story in each of them, but there are some general categories. General category number one is process that we've talked about.
The internal NIMBYs.
Go ahead and say it.
The internal NIMBYs.
So there's the process piece, which we've tried to address. There's also the market piece, which is even if you had the best local government process in the world, you just may not have market conditions ripe to develop that piece of ground. And then you mentioned the disconnect right now between for rent product versus for sale product. And so we all want more for sale. You want your adult kids to move out of your house and ideally buy their own home. And those are the hardest to produce right now. And then you have the infrastructure piece. So I'm going to focus on infrastructure here for a second because this is, Chris mentioned the consensus items we've been working on this summer. This is one where we've got consensus on the concept. We're trying to figure out the exact details and certainly welcome the expertise of people in this room. On the infrastructure side, that is a public-private partnership. We are having conversations with state leaders about repurposing the state infrastructure bank in a way that can be laser focused on unlocking those entitled housing units and facilitating more housing units. So I'll give one example of a project that right now I think on paper checks lots of boxes for what the new Utah will look like. This is a project in Utah County that has about 1,800 entitled units that are shovel ready, but for the fact it's on a piece of ground that has zero infrastructure in the ground. And these 1,800 units start at 7 units to the acre and go up from there. So there's great housing variety. Likewise, there are a couple of pocket parks in this proposal, and there's some small commercial. So it's getting to a center type concept. But the overall infrastructure cost for that project is about $90 million. So the city has some resources, the developer has some resources, they're trying to figure out how to get to the finish line. So the conversation we've been having at the state level is, can we use some state seed money, some infrastructure, state infrastructure bank money as a revolving loan to help that type of project unlock those units, because it's the type of units and the type of density, the type of ideally owner occupancy and affordability that we want to see. Can we get those units unlocked, remove that obstacle? You still may have market obstacles, but at least you remove that initial obstacle to get those units in the ground. Because at the end of the day, North Ogden, there are more North Ogdens out there that are smaller and don't have $90 million to invest in infrastructure. The developers don't have $90 million to invest in infrastructure. How do we, how can the state play a partnership role that complements some of the other planning mandates that we've worked together on?
We are getting close to time. We've got time for maybe one, maybe two more questions, but let's go over here.
Diehl, this is coming to you. So it was either last month or 2 months ago, I went to the Newsmaker breakfast, and I had my paradigm completely changed by something Diehl said, and I'm hoping that you can repeat it. When you were talking about our per capita density, when we think that we're actually zoning less when it comes to the amount of people in houses and basements and such.
That sounds like a Jim Wood statement, but I'm not sure what the question is.
Okay, well, it was more of a statement. A statement you said.
Remind me.
Anyway, when we think that we're normally zoning like maybe quarter acres or smaller lots, but all that ends up happening is we stack more people in the basements, whereas if we separated them.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, when we talk about we have a housing shortage in Utah, people are asking, well, where are these people? And we're seeing more and more doubling up. So when we're looking at some of our data, is you're starting to see all across the state, I mean, really all across the country, those people are in basements. Our vacancy rate, albeit it's going to go up a little bit in some instances, but apartment vacancy rate has been sub 4% for almost a decade. Right, so that's where we're seeing the problem. So we need to unlock that supply a little bit more. And what worries me, to your point, is what I'm hearing from Chris and other developers alike is we're going to slow down our production because we don't work for free, right? Some of our data says we're going to keep growing. So our housing shortage we're forecasting, we released data a couple of weeks ago, is our housing shortage is going to get worse the next couple of years. So all these, we've never had a housing recession during a housing shortage. So, people freak out, oh, the market's a bubble, market's going to crash. If you had asked me a couple of years ago that interest rates are going to be at 8% and our year-over-year housing price is going to be more or less the same, I would have thought you're crazy. You don't understand the simple dynamics of supply and demand. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what happened. Because we're so severely underbuilt that I spent 18 months in my mother-in-law's basement. Look at me. I had hair. Just kidding. Don't send her the tapes. But the house we were fortunate enough to outbid other people on, I would have never bought it. I looked at it and I said to my wife, I do not want to deal with this crap. Great location, the worst house. Now I have to figure out how to remodel it, and I need to call some friends to help me just basically tear it out. But that's the problem of new young families that you're forced to go into a basement.
All right.
I was just going to say, I do think that's fascinating that this density is already in our communities. It's just hidden by these multifamily, or multi-generational houses. It's an interesting point.
We have time for maybe one more question. Yes.
Okay.
Oh.
All right. Yes, Greg Cronin. I just recently moved back from Mississippi. Took a wife there from Utah at BYU 20 years ago, and we got back 4 years ago. We're living in the same rental house I bought in BYU because I can't buy a house. So I know how it is for my 3 children. They're here as well. I work with a development company, and we do have some entitled lots around Utah, approximately 4,000 throughout the state that are out there. And our problem is more of what Cameron was speaking of, and I think has hit very hard, and that is infrastructure. Is that the cities are looking to the developers to build the infrastructure for the town now. And where we've run into this a few times, I think policy from state to municipal is that we spend money on a lot of things that aren't the housing crisis or aren't the primary issues of our communities. We spend a lot of other money, other places, that are not being able to be put into the proper planning by a community to open up infrastructure, sewer lines, roads, and to actually put that burden onto the developer has caused a greater delay in the state to put inventory on the ground. So what I wanted to ask the question, and it's kind of one of those where I'm backing what Cameron said. I thank you, Cameron. But my biggest struggle is when you go to a town and you're looking for a PID, the towns are resisting them, like they're not familiar with them. It was a state policy put in place. There's a conference today on it. But when we have to go through the education and efforts to get a PID, we're asking the private sector to cover infrastructure for towns and push that out. It drives the investment dollars up for the investments. It creates higher cost housing. There's just no way unless we can look at better planning ahead of time where this growth is going to go with the communities, seeing that ahead. So how are we going to address the either further adoption of PIDs more rapidly by communities? Because we're looking at 12, 18-month delays to try to get people on board for that. And it's already been passed by the state.
Before any of you respond, I just want to say quickly, PID is a private infrastructure district. It's a tool that was kind of created a little while ago, and we're going to have I guess we're going to have a session a little bit later on.
Yeah, great lead in to the 1:30 session.
Yeah. Anyone here want to respond or anything? Or
Sorry,
take that as a comment? Thanks. Thanks, Laura.
Yeah, I think there's some a lot of pushback, particularly along the Wasatch Front, from communities in adopting PIDs initially, primarily because the initial tool was using mill levies and raising property taxes, and elected officials don't like property taxes anyway, and they certainly don't want them in districts that they don't control. More widely adopted in resort communities. You look in Washington County, probably 70% of all the PIDs have been approved in Utah have been approved somewhere on a resort community because those buyers are not as property tax sensitive. But there's other ways to do it, and I think come to the PID session later. There's other ways to different kinds of bonds that you can use that you can retire outside of property taxes. But it is a good tool, and it is a challenge, right? The infrastructure is a real challenge.
Yeah, let me add to this. I personally have learned some lessons about how the PID bill has rolled out and the education, or in some cases lack thereof, around it. Just in the last couple of weeks, I've had personal face-to-face conversations with 4 different small communities that are on the edge of growth, where the conversation basically started. We had a developer come to our town, want to do this PID. What is it? Help me understand it. And after walking them through I'm an attorney by profession, but we as a league do not provide legal counsel to the cities. So my role is the Q&A, right? This is what it is. This is what you need to be looking at. By the time we finished that conversation, all 4 of those communities said, yeah, we could see this having some value in our community, and they were better prepared to come back and have those conversations with those developers. So I do think there is an educational component around not just PIDs, but all the tools that Chris was talking about, that if we all agree, private sector and public sector can agree that we need to overcome this infrastructure challenge, and we need to overcome it immediately, okay, then let's make sure everybody has all the tools that they need and the understanding that they need to have that real conversation about the pros and cons of each of those different tools so that you can invest in the infrastructure.
All right. Lunch is here. Heaven forbid that we stand in the way of lunch. Join us in thanking our panelists for this great discussion.